now, this is Right Time Reborn, America's newest political podcast, coming to you from both the captive state of New York, the so-called Empire State or Vampire State, and down here in sunny Florida, or as we like to call it this week, DeSantis land. I'm Rebecca. I'm your host. We got our co-host Brittany O'Toole from the slave state of New York, Hocus Pocus land, and welcome to the show, Brittany. How are you today?
Doing well. Looking to kick off a nice Memorial Day weekend. It's actually supposed to be very nice weather here for a change. So
it is Memorial Day weekend. And on that note, I think we should definitely remind people that Memorial Day isn't about burgers and hot dogs and potato salad. And it's not about playing great music and having games outside while we're having a picnic. It's about remembering the reason we're able to celebrate, the reason we have this great country of ours, the people who gave everything, those who died in combat. And there are far too many of them over the last 247 years who have died for the rest of us. So
yes, I completely agree. It's always a somewhat solemn weekend for me. I mean, but yes, I think it's okay to go still have a picnic and everything like that. But if you can make it to a Memorial Day parade, or I put my flags out right before we started recording, actually, just in my planters outside. It's for me, my dad is a retired veteran, and I like to be thankful that I don't celebrate Memorial Day particularly for him, because he's still with us. And then they have to think about so many people who are not. And so it's always something that I feel like it's not the kickoff to summer. It's a weekend of memorial, and I feel the same way about 9/11 as well. And I feel like that's also fading away a bit, but I do think that we can have a nice picnic and do spend time with family respectfully. I think that is possible.
It's fine to have the picnics and the barbecues and so forth, but it's just not the purpose.
Right.
That's secondary. The main thing is that we have lost people, and not just in the distant past, Iraq and Afghanistan and all these little fires that we put out all over the world, some of which we don't even hear about. People die to keep our country free. I'm
sure we don't hear about a lot of them. So, yes. Right. So that, yes, the moment of solidarity for that. And it's a weekend to just keep that in mind. And remember that these people have sacrificed their lives so that we can sit here and have this conversation, and let alone a good weekend. So.
Well, this week has been an interesting one from a political standpoint, not only from in presidential politics, but we've had some really good news come out of the Supreme Court yesterday. So we've got a bunch of things to talk about today. What do you want to start with?
Well, I'll let you go. I mean, I tend to think that we should probably talk about Ron DeSantis announcing, because there's been a lot of lead up to it. We've been talking about it in
Ron
particular.
Who's that?
Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, Ron
and also
DeSantis.
because I know you're very excited
governor.
about it, and it's not that I'm not excited about it. I just think it's all interesting. I'll leave it out the word interesting of the commentary and how they did it. I'll let you start with that. Let's go. I'll pick talking about Ron DeSantis' announcement, and you start.
Well, okay. Wednesday evening, Ron DeSantis announced that he is running for president. And he was his official announcement was on Elon Musk's Twitter Spaces show. And there were some technical difficulties in the beginning. From what I understand from friends of mine who were actually able to get in, about 15 minutes after all the difficulties started, everything was fixed and it went smoothly from that point on. You wouldn't know it to read what was in the newspapers and the press, which tried to make it out to be a catastrophe. But the reality is that the reason it crashed is because there were so many people who wanted to see it. It was over 700,000 people, and they weren't expecting that number. It's that simple. They were just not expecting the number of people that actually wanted to hear what he had to say. And he was smart about it, because before he actually went on the Twitter show, on Elon Musk's Twitter show, DeSantis released on his own Facebook page and his own Twitter a short video making his announcement that he's running. And it was sort of a soft announcement, and the Twitter thing was the hard announcement, but at least he had something that was there. He was very presidential in what he said. He was very statesmanlike. He kept to the issues, kept to the important pieces of information that most Americans want to hear in an announcement. He did later on go after Donald Trump in other venues, but not there. He didn't turn that into a free for all, or as some of my Irish friends like to call it, a Donnybrook. I love that word. That is one of the best words for a riot. But
yeah. Well, that's yes. So I heard a lot about it, and I've been reading a lot about it since. And basically, half of the right-wing people in my circles that I speak to kind of had the same commentary that you just gave. And then the other half aren't people who are not, they're definitely not pro-Trump. They're not, that I would say they're right-leaning people, but they were disappointed. And from a campaign manager or campaign staffer experience point of view, I can't really discount what the commentary they gave me, but they're basically saying that, so let's break it down a little bit. So one, they were talking about the choice of Twitter Space. So it wasn't just Twitter, it was Twitter Space, which I'm going to be completely honest with you, I had no idea existed before this announcement. So I don't even know what that is. I saw a teaser on Instagram, and I got to tell you, that had less than 100,000 views. And we've already spoke about this privately, that, Instagram is not, while it's essential and not a bad idea for politics, that's not the social media platform. That's not the number one. It's right. So, that's for different fields. So it's always
mostly Twitter
secondary.
and Facebook at this point.
Right. And when you and I have even worked together on campaigns, we said Instagram was like a tertiary thing to Twitter and Facebook. So yes. So, but that's where I happen to see it, because I'm on Instagram for other things. And it was a teaser. It was him walking through the curtain or whatever it was with I believe it was Ronald Reagan quotes. No, that was the teaser.
I didn't see the Instagram one. Is it the same one that?
I believe so.
Yeah, on Facebook?
I believe it was. Yes. And then
there was a quote from Reagan in there.
Yes. And then the next day is when he did the announcement on Twitter, and there was the whole crash. So multiple things. So you and I had talked, and you felt that how could a crash like that? You can't get 700,000 people on the new part of it. Was kind of more on Twitter and Elon Musk. And I heard a lot of
technical end of things.
Well, and sure it is, but there is an element of a little bit of blame being, how do you launch a presidential campaign, even if they don't have the abilities to do with the technicality of it? You make sure that you release your presidential campaign announcement on a platform that can handle it. So they said that was a campaign staff failure. And I think that I honestly can empathize with both of those arguments. So, and I do think it was a problem, because apparently more than half the people got a blank screen,
myself included. And I understand what you're saying, and I do agree with it to a certain point. But the reality is that these days everything is going on the internet. Even TV most people are watching it on the internet at this point. And if the medium you're using crashes for whatever reason, you're going to have a problem. And regardless of whether you announce on CBS or NBC or CNN or Fox News or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or, Uncle Charlie's homemade social media platform, if you don't have enough servers, if you don't have enough bandwidth, and it's something that the candidate and the campaign has no control over, you're going to have a problem.
Yes. And it
Where
seems like they
I
did a
think
little
they
bit.
made the mistake was that the Twitter Spaces was untested for that level of for that burden,
Yes.
that level of audience, that size of audience.
Yes.
And because of that, they didn't know how things were going to work. So it wasn't a huge issue as far as responsibility is concerned, but it was enough of one that it's something that everybody should learn from, not just DeSantis.
Yes.
All politicians, regardless of what they're running for, use a seasoned platform. I have no doubt that
Yes.
Twitter Spaces, that today they are installing 10 times as many servers and broadening the bandwidth that's available and so forth. So this will never happen again on Twitter Spaces because of what happened on Wednesday. But today or Wednesday, they didn't have the ability there. And today we're looking at Ron DeSantis and wondering what happened. But
Yep.
it doesn't seem to have hurt him. It does not seem to have hurt Ron DeSantis, because the 24 hours after he announced, he made more money than any presidential candidate in history. $8.2 million in a 24-hour period. Previous record was
Did he?
6.8
Wow.
million by Joe Biden in the last election. And before that, it was 5.9 million by Donald Trump in the 2016 election. So if that's any indication that whoever sets the new record ends up winning the election, that's a good sign for Ron DeSantis. You know, Trump
Right.
set the
And
record in
he's
16 and
coming
he
in with
won.
a war test that is already bigger than Trump's, correct?
So yeah, and Biden set the new record in 2020 and he won. And hopefully this is an indicator of what will happen.
Right.
DeSantis has come out of the corner swinging. I mean, he's come out and he's talked about Donald Trump's fiscal irresponsibility, and he's talked about the fact that Trump was ready to make deals about giving immunity to illegal aliens in order to get money for the wall. He's talked about a bunch of things. And one thing is really telling. One of the sentences that he uses, I don't know what's happened to him, but Donald Trump is not the same person he was in 2016. That's actually not a bad line to take, because it explains his earlier
and
support
smart
of Trump.
Yes. Yeah.
And still gives him the ability to criticize him now. I hope that after an initial period of launching a bunch of criticism at Trump, that DeSantis will back off of that and focus entirely or almost entirely on Biden. That worked for him very, very well in the gubernatorial election. He didn't even acknowledge his opponent, Charlie Crist. All he did was talk about Biden. And this time around, he should be doing the same thing. He shouldn't be focusing on Trump. He should be focusing on Biden, so that people will think of him as the go-to person for beating Biden.
Well, I think focusing on Biden's actual failures or lack,
Yes.
or at best case scenario, doing nothing. But at the same time, I would also focus on the strength of what he did in the Florida GOP, because, you know, you and I can say that, you know, the infrastructure as a whole, especially nationally, is very weak. So,
Yeah,
if you could look at what he's done, I would, if I were him, I would focus on that as well, so people could have faith in a new Republican Party that really doubles down on the conservative values, which he has the record to prove that. That's not just talk. That's not just talking a big talk.
Look, you weren't around yet in the 1980s, and I watched Ronald Reagan, and that's a compliment, by the way. I watched Ronald Reagan as a teenager. I was a teenager, not him. And he was very positive. He was very strong on, this is what conservatism means. This is what conservatism does. This is what we believe. This is our strength. This is what will renew this nation. And then after Reagan left office, we slowly started to take a position where we're defensive, where we start to say things like,
overall negative.
Let's not talk about this issue. Let's not talk about that issue. We're only going to hurt ourselves if we talk about this other issue. And Reagan never did that. Reagan did not back off of any issue, whether it was Soviet communism, the economy, strengthening our military, abortion, whatever it was. He never backed off of an issue. He never backed away from talking about it. In certain parts of the country, like where you are, it's become a staple of Republican politics to be embarrassed by certain issues. We can't talk about that because we'll lose votes. The reality is we don't lose votes by talking about the things that we believe in. We lose
and it backfires on the ground. And I know this, being a grassroots campaigner, it backfires because then you get those Republicans, and I wouldn't even completely exclude myself of them, that are just like, come on, like, stop being so weak. Like, what are you scared of? You're already losing.
Yeah.
And it's very disenfranchising. This is what makes people stay home and small elections and things like that.
And I think this is what, in some part, that attracted people to Donald Trump. I don't think he believed in the things that he said, but he was
had a backbone.
He was
the feeling that he had a backbone in the pool of everyone being terrible definitely helped him, and that was just I think that helped him.
Yeah, but now look at what he does.
But now we're different because DeSantis is doing that as well, and has a record.
DeSantis is doing it more than Trump did.
Has a record.
And Trump, just like a few weeks ago, when Florida passed the 6-week abortion ban, he said Trump decided, well, that's too harsh. Well, he was all for all kinds of restrictions on abortion when he was president. Suddenly, because he's trying to differentiate himself from Ron DeSantis, he's playing the same game that Republicans have played for a long time. DeSantis is a lot more like Reagan than people realize. Now, I'm not saying he's a lot like Reagan, because Reagan was a once in a lifetime, once in a century kind of person. But DeSantis is following that kind of playbook where he says, this is what we believe in. I am not ashamed of it. I will talk about it. I will fight for it. I will push these laws through the legislature, and I will sign them with great fanfare. And he did that with open carry, and he did that with the 6-week abortion ban, and he did that with the parental rights bills, and with the election reform bills that are taking away a lot of the things that the Democrats have been abusing around the country, like voter registration bundling. And they passed 30 strong laws, among a bunch of other things, but 30 strongly conservative laws in about 2.5 months, a little less than 2.5 months, during this latest legislative session in the Florida state legislature. And DeSantis very proudly signed them, and we saw him pushing for these things. And that is an example for how we need to fight these elections. We need to view it as war. We need to view it as a battle between right and wrong. And if we don't, we're going to keep losing.
Right. Well, it's been difficult after a couple of campaign cycles in New York. And I completely agreed with trying to get those middle of the road voters on certain issues, particular congressional campaigns that I either worked on directly or more as a committee person indirectly. And I do think for certain candidates it did make sense. But at the end of the day, I think any victories, most of them didn't win. And then the ones that did, I give credit to someone who did what I believe in a parallel, but more New York tailored way to what DeSantis has done. I do feel Lee Zeldin and his movement, which he's still continuing, and the doubling down on the conservative platform. And
what Zeldin and DeSantis really did follow Reagan's model. DeSantis did it with a great deal of success, and he not only won re-election, took it by almost 20 points. Zeldin unfortunately didn't get elected, but he did very well in the New York election, and that was to attract those middle of the road voters that you just spoke about without compromising their conservative principles.
without
is something we have not
with
seen
cons-
since Ronald
yes,
Reagan.
and I gotta tell you, I mean, this isn't something that they just figured out. That was their campaign plan from day one. I was working with them from day one. That was the platform from day one. And do I think that Lee Zeldin personally makes his executive campaign staff have migraines every day? Probably, because they might be looking at polls and things like that and being like, well, and I've even known this in my experience when he was in Congress. He would just, there'd be one politically consultant strategic way to handle something, and then he would just vote on principle, and he's almost always stuck to that. I mean, well, the only point that I've ever argued is that with the abortion issue in New York, he just said, I cannot and will not change New York's abortion law. He never said he wasn't pro-life, and because the Democrats were succeeding so much on that issue, he did have to say that, but I don't think any of that was disingenuous. So, um,
But
yeah,
I
I
do
mean,
I do think that there's probably a better way of explaining it.
maybe
Um,
this was very 11th hour in the campaign because, no, I mean, his congressional record is pro-life.
yeah,
So,
and he certainly could have said that. He said, look, we could say, I am pro-life. Here's my record. The fact that we are unable to make progress on this in New York State does not mean that I do not support us making progress on this issue nationally, especially in the states where things can be done. Here in New York, we are facing massive economic problems, massive financial problems, and that's where our focus needs to be,
yes,
especially
and it
given that we
was.
cannot actually move the needle on abortion. Um, and uh, and he should have said, historically, Republicans have handled the economy better than the Democrats every single time.
And crime. It was big on crime, very big on crime.
Crime's
That was
another one.
his
Crime's
campaign
another
platform,
one.
and essentially it was. But there was one messaging, and that was not a. I'd say a camp. I always say every campaign plan has 3 points. At least it's their three, at least three. The true three campaign platforms, and abortion, of course, wasn't one of them. It was crime, the economy, and cost of living, which is also the economy. So, um, but they did have to respond to the abortion issue after a while, because Kathy Hochul, that was the only thing she was running on was the abortion issue,
Yeah.
because it was I guess motivating to a base, and it worked well for Pat Ryan in New York 18 and everything. So because you're striking chords with that.
And one mistake that I think Zeldin made, and Republican politicians in general tend to make this, is we constantly let the Democrats frame the debate.
Yes,
so Kathy Hochul comes
so
out and says
annoying.
abortion, 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 and Zeldin responds to abortion rather than saying something like, Madam Governor, I'm not surprised that you want to talk about abortion, because if we talk about the real issues that are a problem here in New York, like crime, the economy, jobs, and so forth, you have nothing to say. You and your predecessor have been complete failures on those issues. And those are the issues that really matter to New Yorkers. So why don't we talk about them instead of talking about issues that most of us will never have to deal with?
Well, in all fairness, I did help certain senior staff, and I didn't. Not that I made any of the ads, but they always asked me for my opinion before they ever put them out. They did take that route, and this is the 11th hour. This is after he already campaigned for 2 years, and we could loop this together right now. I mean, DeSantis came in for Lee in the last 2 weeks of the campaign cycle in November, and they did a rally in Hop New York, which is where my husband's from, and I'm from the bordering town of Smithtown on Long Island. And it was massive. It was crazy. And I don't even know if they were. That is Lee's hometown area. He does very well there. Nassau and Suffolk counties have a lot of those back. It's teachers, cops, self-made professionals in middle class Long Island. So that's
Mhm.
the bread and butter of who was supporting him. And then DeSantis coming in, I swear some people just came for DeSantis. So it was an amazing rally. It was very substantial. It was crazy. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but it was hundreds of thousands.
Well, DeSantis is right now a rock star. There's no question about it. And I think what one of the ways in which we define how popular somebody is through polls. But polls depend on the question. They depend on the pool of people that are being called. They depend on how you massage those numbers based on weighting of one demographic group over another. They're not always the most accurate thing in the world. But looking at the number of small donations that DeSantis brought in, because you're limited to, I think it's $2,500 per person for the entire primary season. So you get $8.2 million.
For a congressional campaign, I believe it's 28. I could be wrong, but I believe it's 28. But he was running, but they were both running for governor. So in New York State, the limits that I'm so used to for an FEC or congressional campaign, they're out the window for a state campaign for New York.
Right, because FEC has nothing to do with state elections.
Yeah, but in New York State, it kind of seems like a free for all to me. I mean, I have less experience with state campaigns than the congressional ones, but it kind of seems like a free for all in my experience.
Here in Florida, we do have limits on what the campaign can bring in, but we have a Florida version of the PAC that we could just call a political committee, and those can take as much money as they want. And Ron DeSantis brought in a lot of money when he was running for governor, or for re-election for governor. Brought a lot of money into his own campaign and also into the affiliated PAC, and he had over $80 million left in or not PAC, political committee. He had over $80 million left in his political committee, which just went into his federal PAC, in addition to 40 million that they'd already collected, and now another almost 9 million. It's probably up to somewhere around 12 or 15 million.
I heard it was even more than that. Yeah.
They're expecting to have somewhere around $200 million very shortly in the PAC.
I heard they were at like 181 or something, and this is just through the grapevine.
It's
I don't know.
Massive number for somebody who's just launched.
Right. Well, let's take a moment there, though. But yes, that's all good, and I know this, having had a very brief stint in campaign management, and this. If you have money to spend, of course, that's great. But then let's actually think about the voters outside of that, outside the political industry, and is that supposed to be impressive though? Like, you have all this money because I already see if Trump has less money, it would be an obvious communication strategy for the Trump campaign to be like, look at all this money he has. He's an establishment hack. So and I'm not saying I agree it was a great, but let's just be careful about, just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean it's impressive. I worked for congressional candidates. Kyle Vandewater had no money at all. He had no establishment money at all. And I had volunteers who went out and did more for him than candidates who did.
But that's why the 8.2 million that he made in his first 24 hours, which did not go into a PAC, which consisted entirely of small donations. It was not $1 million donations, not even $10,000 donations. There's a limitation. So it shows a level of popularity, because to get to $8 million requires a lot of donors. Most of those people are not donating the limit. They're donating $50 or $100 or $200. So it's what
I do, right? So yeah, I mean, that's like, you're looking at a voter like myself, a middle class family in New York, and what else can you do? And if anything, it actually makes me upset that I sometimes donate any money to any politician. So it's difficult. So I'm just saying we just have to be careful. Like, yes, it's great that he's fundraising well, but that's also a double-edged sword in terms of like communicating with certain voters and things like that, because I've seen a grassroots effort for campaigns that have had almost no money.
Well, one of the interesting things that the PAC, the DeSantis affiliated PAC has made known is that they're going to run things a little bit differently than PACs have in the past. Instead of just spending money on advertising, TV, radio, internet, and so forth, they're actually going to fund the ground game on the PAC level. And that is
that's
huge.
exactly what I was going to say needs to be done, because if I only had a couple more bucks on a ground game grassroots campaign, which I'm talking about Kyle Vanderwaters, which was, he had no establishment help, and there was a lot that went into that I'm not going to get into, but he didn't have it. That's all. That was all my only concern as a manager in the last 6 weeks. He didn't have that money. So, if you can get the grassroots people plus a little bit of the grassroots money, I know what the bottom lines are for a campaign, because I think almost we were in the negative the day I got asked to come in September of a November cycle. And there are a lot of bare bones that you can do. And granted, he didn't win, right? But I'm just saying that he still had a campaign. I still had more volunteers go out for him than I did for candidates who had millions.
Well, what this PAC is doing, from what they announced, they are putting, look, one of the issues that we're having is, before the era of the PACs began, the campaigns raised their money and they lived and died by that money, and that was it. There was no outside money coming. Then came Citizens United and the era of the 527s and the super PACs and all these other organizations began, and money and 501c4s and so forth. And money started flowing in massive amounts. You know, where you used to spend $50 million on a presidential campaign, now you don't get away with less than $1 billion, and
Right.
sometimes it's got to be more than that. But the money that is being spent is in PACs. So the campaigns themselves had to run these ground games, but they didn't have a lot of money to do it because all the money was in another organization. By moving the ground game into the PAC and letting the PAC do it, the amount of money that they can put into it changes dramatically. And what they've said is in the first 5 primary states, 5 primary and caucus states, they are putting together ground teams in those states that are going to knock on the door of every Republican and every Republican-leaning non-Republican voter in each of the states 4 times and 5 times in Iowa between now and those primaries and those caucuses. You know as well as I do that it's hard to even get everything covered once. To set a goal of 4 and 5 times in less than a year, that's very ambitious. And if they have the money to be able to do that, it will make a huge difference in how the how people see Ron DeSantis in those early states.
I mean, there's a couple different things to, yes, I agree with all of that, but there's a couple different things to that. You could pay anyone, and look, I've done it. I recently did it. I worked for PACs and this last cycle, and then I paused my committee work and I went to paid contract work with canvassing for PACs for campaigns that I was working with, but that I had to stop working with when I worked for the PACs. So for obvious reasons, you cannot do any kind of cross communication. So look, you could pay anyone to do $25 an hour to go knock on doors, and that's essentially what the national congressional campaigns do. I was one of the only locals that was going out, and that resonates with people, because then I would get messages, and I'm not going to say which campaign that this happened for, but I'd just say it was a congressional campaign, and I had people who knew I was on local committee or just involved locally and message me and be like, people came to my door for this candidate and I want to support him, but they're clearly not from here. And it was weird. And is it real? We thought it was a scam. And these are people that you're paying $25 an hour. I don't know if it's a New York thing. Perhaps it's just a New York thing, but a lot of these PACs bring in people from nationally to go to specific areas. And I get asked all the time to do it and go out somewhere else. And obviously I'm not doing that because that's not defending my lifestyle right now, being a mom of many young children. But that's not the same thing as a committee person or a local volunteer, or I'm not going to lie. I drove around in my 2009 Toyota Highlander with a bunch of palm cards in my car with my young children, sitting there with the campaign t-shirts on, coming with me door to door. And that has a different impact on people than someone that is very clearly being paid $25 or $30 an hour. It doesn't even matter what they're being paid. Some campaigns pay a lot more than that or PACs to go around and knock on doors and drop a palm card. And I'm not saying that's not effective or they wouldn't do it at all. But when you talk about a grassroots effort, I've even met with people since and like, we'll never forget, like you wanted to flip New York 19 so bad. You had your little toddler on your shoulder and we're sitting there following Kyle around. And I was like,
I gotta
yeah,
say that
because
image is
if I
adorable.
wasn't going to do it, who else is going to? And that I'm doing it for those kids that I'm holding. And that's exactly, that stuff resonates with people more than a solicitor at their door. So it's great that they have money to spend to do that. And I'm sure there's an impact on that. I did some surveying for a contractor for Zeldin's campaign, and they actually never sent me to Republicans' house. I went to all Indies and Democrats' house to do surveying. That wasn't even campaigning. It was surveying. We just did polling. And I did a lot of different stuff in this last cycle. And there's a grand effect to people who are just passionate about the cause, and it actually like resonates with people. But that takes, it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, especially if you're in New York, who has time on their hands to go do that? You know what I mean?
I agree with everything you're saying, but I have to point out the fact that Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada and so the early states, they are so used to having outsiders in there. The press coming from all over the country.
Yes.
The campaign staff of the candidates, the PACs, everybody, they're used to it because they have an outsized importance in the primary season. So I think because they're used to it, they'll have less of a reticence about it than somebody who comes to you and had never had an out of the area person knock on their door before, and they're saying, hey, who are these people? They don't have that.
Yes.
Who are these people?
I do think it's a New
questioning
York thing. And I mean, I kind of tend to agree. If someone that is clearly not from here coming to my door, actually, I'm having a deja vu moment right now. When Antonio Delgado run, when I moved up here from New York 1 to New York 19 in 2018, I watched the bus of people, and I guess they were from New York City, wherever they congregated them, drop off a bunch of people from the city at Quick Check in Saugerties. And then they put on the Antonio Delgado sticker. And again, he was the New York 19 congressman, and now he's the New York's lieutenant governor, which is why there was a special election that we often talk about.
Lucky
and yeah. And I watched them go around, and they came to my door and they were like, and they actually, the one that came to my door lied and was like, I am a local and I'm supporting Antonio Delgado. I'm like, no, you're not. I just watched you get off a coach bus from the city. And to me, it's just like, I already wasn't going to be voting for Delgado, but I mean, that is, you're lying. And then people don't like it on either side. And Republican campaigns do it too. And I'm not even saying that it's wrong. It's just, they're
and I guarantee they were told to lie.
It's not a grassroots effort.
I guarantee they were told to lie. And I guarantee they were told that if they're caught in the lie, just move on to the next house and keep doing the same thing.
Yes, you're given a script. They're given a script, and actually, they then depending on the contract, some of these PACs they'll do a shadow check on you and make sure you keep to the script and things like that. Yeah, and not even blaming the person. I'm just like, you're not from here. I just saw I literally was just behind you at the gas station, watching you get off the coach bus. So that's disingenuous. That I'm not voting for you. Brooklyn flipped New York 19, and I would like to believe that New York 19 was flipped back by locals, but it's difficult, by locals. New York 19 also flipped back because Lee Zeldin did very well and topped the ticket. So
yeah, Lee Zeldin did well. We should have done better nationally and had this red wave that everybody was expecting, but the election atmosphere was changed by the fact that that certain people who shouldn't have stuck their noses into the congressional and Senate elections did stick their noses in. And I'm not going to name any names at this point, Donald Trump.
Well, so one more thing I just wanted to say on this note, and maybe we can start to move on. When we're talking about that grassroots effort, and I'm not someone running for office, right? I've been I'm on all the local committees, and that is technically elected office, but I'm not saying I'm in public office outside the party. So one thing that I've noticed is that just because I care, and look, I was trying to raise my kids and I wasn't working full time or anything at the time. My husband was, and getting his career off the ground. And I got sucked into politics, like really just to be active because I care about my kids' future. That meant me bringing my kids around, okay, to campaign events and doing things like that with them, and me being very passionate about it, because I don't care what people say. If I'm passionate about something for them, I'm going to say it. And that's what actually got me into all of this to begin with, because if it's not for them, it doesn't matter. So
You
that
know,
kind of
are you,
effort sticks with people, and they remember it. I'm hearing it years later, and that's just me as a grassroots volunteer. So what does that mean if it's actually the politician, right? So one thing that I've noticed is I've worked for campaigns where the politician had the support of the campaign for the family and didn't. And I'm not blaming any of them in particular, because it is a lot. I mean, I would never tell a candidate to be on board for a campaign unless their wife and their children, or husband and their children, were completely on board, because I've even had to ask for my husband's support to be a volunteer at all on a campaign. Okay. Because it's all in. You have to do it. You're out there. And those successful ones, one thing I got to say is I know Lee Zeldin and his family, I know his daughters and his wife, they're all in, and it's not because he told them to. Like, they decided, they were all doing it, and that was one of the reasons that was successful. So to that aspect, one of the biggest criticisms that I've heard about this DeSantis announcement was that they didn't include his wife or his beautiful family in it at all, and that might have been a messaging error.
oh, they will. They will.
I'm
It's
sure
just
they will. How could they
look,
not? But that
look,
was one of the biggest things that
one
the
one of the
critics are
things
getting
that
stuck on.
one of the things
Yeah,
that people have to understand is Casey DeSantis, the first lady of Florida. She recently defeated her breast
cancer,
cancer issue that she
cancer.
had.
Yeah,
And there's still, when somebody is that close to this situation, they still have fatigue and so forth. You have to excuse my dogs. They must see something in the backyard. Um, she and she's dealing with two small children, so they're trying to balance all this. They're trying to juggle all of this.
oh yeah.
But
Oh, it's
having
not
seen the
easy.
way she participated in both of his gubernatorial campaigns, I have no doubt that she's going to be a key figure in his presidential campaign.
I don't either. The biggest criticism is that I've heard is, how could you do a presidential announcement, and like, apparently there was no video that was able to be shared. There was no good photo, and some of that came with choosing Twitter to be how they did it. It just kind of seemed like a logistical failure from their campaign standpoint, and they're like, whoever their management is should be wiped out now. And that was and this is just one side of the coin of what I heard. I had others who were saying great news, blah, blah, blah. And I tend to be on that side. But I think that
I look at it from
we
a more
can't,
more
sorry.
pragmatic standpoint. I don't think that it's either a failure or a triumph. I think it's a lesson.
Yes. So, and to that effect, when we're talking about DeSantis now and going forward and leaning towards him a bit, not saying I wouldn't support whoever our nominee is going to be, but we do need, you can't support anyone without being able to be critical of them, I think.
Sure.
So that's what I'm attempting to do here.
You want them to be better, and criticism, when it is not done to tear somebody down, when it is more, let's not use the word criticism, let's use the word critique.
Yes.
Critiques of
That's
the
better.
people you support are of immense use, as long as the person doesn't take it personally. And we know
I don't
that some
think
politicians do.
DeSantis is taking anything personally,
No, of
other
course
than
not.
what he's trying to do.
Of course not.
Trump.
One of the
yes.
great things that I like about DeSantis is he announced right up ahead of time that he's going to make the Supreme Court more conservative than it is today once he's president. And speaking of the Supreme Court, how do you like that segue? We had a couple of really important decisions come down just yesterday. One is a property tax issue. Up until now, something like 22 states were allowed to, if you didn't pay your property taxes, they were allowed to take your property, sell it off at auction, and keep the entire proceeds. So even if you only owed $5,000, if they sold your house for 150,000, they kept the extra 145. Well, the Supreme Court yesterday said,
That's
no,
sick.
you can't do that. It was unanimous. The liberals and the conservatives all agreed on this. John Roberts wrote the opinion, and he had one tremendous line. Yes, we must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but no more than that. And that was a tremendous line.
That's a great way to put it. I mean,
That
it's
is a
it's
tremendous line.
disgusting. It's disgusting.
Well, the thing is that in and of itself, this isn't a huge victory, because what these states are going to end up doing is they will pass legislation that'll increase the amount of interest that can be charged. They will increase the penalties. That will actually make it more difficult for people to get caught up when they're late on their property taxes. So we're going to end up with more property tax auctions. The states will screw around with this wherever they can, just like they tried to screw around, especially in the blue states, with the gun control decision from last year. But
Right.
the thing that makes this important is that for the very first time in U.S. history, the Supreme Court has applied the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment to property taxes. And they've also they also, in another part of the opinion, applied the unfair penalty clause of the Constitution to these property taxes. So now the door is opened to further lawsuits actually attacking property taxes themselves. And we might just get property taxes in this country wiped out, which has to happen. At some point, it has to happen. We cannot consider ourselves a capitalist society, a free market society, if we're allowing government to force people to pay rent. And if you don't pay the money the government demands, then throw you out, then that's rent. Then you don't own your house. That's,
I mean, that's crazy, but I mean, I'm here in New York looking at property taxes where it hits really hard. And
yeah.
It's hard to imagine that. I mean, the state already is in a deficit, taking the highest property taxes from everybody. So what is that going to mean?
And the second highest state income taxes in the country.
Correct. It's just a
capital
dream.
gains taxes than the federal government takes. I mean, it's insane the things that the
it's
state
completely
government in New York
insane.
does.
I mean, this is where a lot of that SALT deduction came into, and that we'll save that for some other time, because I have a lot of tricky opinions to discuss on that SALT deduction and, the Republican tax reform, and what was that, 2018?
Yeah.
That really still, that Republican tax reform did hurt specifically Republican voters in the high income earning Democrat states.
But see,
really bad.
The point on that was that
It was a twofold problem.
But you see, the point is that if we didn't do that, then the people in states that are fiscally responsible, where their taxes are low, where they don't have, for instance, state income tax like Florida does, those folks don't get any kind of deduction out of their federal income taxes, and therefore they are subsidizing the folks that live in the states that are not fiscally responsible.
Right. No, I completely agree. I mean, this was a tough spot when I was actually in Lee Zeldin's congressional office when this was happening. And New York's first congressional district is definitely a district where it's a lot of upper middle class people. And I would say my own family, where I came from, included in that, got hit so hard with that, and he had to vote no on it, but only because he was representing his constituents. I mean, he said that that tax reform was good for the nations as a whole, but it was a twofold problem. New York State's putting on high property taxes like that is the problem, but it doesn't mean that it didn't cost middle and upper middle class people so much, so that is, it's very
but those people need to vote out the the politicians that
Well,
are
I do think that
causing
was a
the
huge
underlying
reason why
problem.
Lee did. I do think that's a huge reason why Lee did very well in the governor election, because a lot of them left to go to your state. And if any of them were still here, they voted for him.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I saw too many New Yorkers in Florida. No, I'm just kidding. They're all over the place. I'm seeing,
It's like an infestation.
and when I lived on the other coast, 9 or 10 years ago, one day I went to the mall and I saw a very expensive car, the New York plate on it. It said UC, and I forget what number it was. And that's one of the plates that are handed out by the county clerk. Each county in New York is to hand out a certain number of plates um, that are usually treated with respect by law enforcement and so forth. So I found out through friends whose car I saw there, and it was a high-ranking official from Ulster County. I won't mention his name, and I really won't this time. But he was down here, and I'm told that he has a second home down here. He's an older gentleman. He's no longer in politics, but he was for a very long time in New York, in Ulster County. And he's got a second house down here and spends half his year down here. There's a former Ulster County legislator who was on the legislature for a very long time, for decades. He was also a professional firefighter, and he now lives in Daytona. He moved down here. Actually, there were a couple of years ago. He was in the. His name is Frank Dart, and he was in the press here because he was on the beach when somebody got run over by a pickup truck that was driving on the beach and shouldn't have been. And Frank, being a retired first responder, was the first one on the scene to help this person. So,
Wow.
so it was it was all over Florida news.
I mean, it's all over. I mean, my father's a Southwest Airlines pilot, and he's done a lot of hard work, but at the end of his career, he's doing very well. He's one of the lead captains on ISLIP, which is Long Island MacArthur Airport in Suffolk County. And he does, him and as well as the couple other Southwest pilots on Long Island go back and forth to Florida every day, bringing snowbirds and families back and forth. I mean, that's always been going on, but particularly now, like way much more now. So
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that, I mean, but and Texas too. It's just the exodus has been going on for quite a while. COVID made it worse, and it's still going on. And one of the reasons that I stay here in New York is because, and I don't know why. Okay, my husband doesn't have to work in New York. He works for a federal agency, so we can go anywhere. But if New Yorkers aren't going to fight it out, who's going to? No one's going to come here to save us. And if New York goes down, if California goes down, it's all going to go down eventually. So I kind of feel like a outer body feeling of staying here. I get very deflated in that, like in the last cycle, but I'm justifying it that New York actually, even though the Republicans did pretty terrible in the last cycle when it should have been in their favor, New York didn't really.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
but okay, so I just want to touch on another Supreme Court case from yesterday because we only have a few minutes left. The EPA case, which was another tremendous case. I think it was in Idaho, if I recall. A family decided to build a house on their own property. They got all the permits from the zoning board and the building inspector and whatever else they needed in Idaho. They got everything. They built up this house. And the EPA comes in and says, no, you have wetlands on your property. You have to tear down the house. And if you don't do that, we're going to fine you $40,000 every single day. $40,000 a day the EPA wanted to. I mean, you're talking about basically terrorism at this point. So these people went to federal court and they appealed this, and it got appealed back and forth all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court voted 9-0 in their favor and against the EPA. Of course, Chuck Schumer came out and criticized the decision, saying it came from a MAGA Supreme Court. I'm sorry, but there were 3 Democrat appointed justices that voted with the conservatives. This was a unanimous decision across the board. Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, all voted the same way, that you can't do this. And the real issue was that the EPA decided that any wetland, even those that are not adjoining a federally protected waterway, because on certain occasions when it's flooding, when there's rain, whatever, they can temporarily somehow join this waterway, that puts any wetland in the country under their auspices. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You cannot just redefine what your authority is. Congress decides what your authority is. You do not expand it based on what you want to do. So this was another tremendous decision by the court.
I wasn't familiar with that specific decision just coming up, but that was something similar happened up here a couple of years ago, and the Trump administration actually was able to reverse it a little bit, or really it was also another campaign for putting more conservative justices on the Supreme Court. But it's something with the waterways, it was really hitting the New York farmers really horribly, basically saying if there's a big rain and there was a pond or a puddle that could be formed and be called a waterway or a pond on a farm, then that was in federal jurisdiction. That I would have to refresh myself on this one, but it was something very similar where actually
it sounds like it's exactly the same thing.
Yes,
and the law that the legal principle they talk about is called WOTUS. WOTUS.
Yes, it was WOTUS.
Waterways of the United States.
And I was campaigning for Kyle at the time, and I talked to the farmers here because in New York 19, it's still a very big farming community, very big in New York. It's a very big district, and they kept talking about WOTUS and saying how when we go into the farmers and talk about them, which actually a lot of them did support Delgado, but everyone's campaigning against him. But they said that, the WOTUS ruling or whatever that impact was killing them. So actually they said that this was one of the achievements of the Trump administration, was that they were able to taper that.
Yeah, but see, anything like that is temporary.
Right. It was temporary, but there was at least some immediate relief. Yes.
But what happened with the Supreme Court yesterday, this is permanent unless Congress changes the law and chooses to change the definition of what a waterway of the United States is constituted of. There's no way to go backwards on this. No future president can redefine what a waterway of the United States is, because we now have a Supreme Court decision that says under the law, this is what it is. You cannot expand that.
So that's really good news. And maybe the next show I could follow up and see how that's going to impact New York 19, because that was a very big issue. I mean, the farmers were getting hurt so hard by that in New York 19.
We're hurting our farmers with these environmental issues all over the place. And we're closing off rivers that they need for water because of some endangered minnow, that there's 30 minnows left, and there's no way that they're going to survive and bounce back, but we're cutting off water to farmers. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd. And we need to put an end to this envirofascism that the left has introduced into the United States. Yes, it is important to take care of our environment. It's important to take care of nature around us, but not so much that we're causing harm to humanity. Humanity has to come first. That's the reason we want to protect nature, is for our own purposes.
Exactly. It's not even just that. It's a lot of, it's not that I'm anti-green. I'm anti the exploitation of the green climate policy idea for government authority, because that's what it is. Well, because that's it.
That's it. You're right. That's it. We're at the end of the show. That's it. Thanks, folks, for joining us and spending another hour listening to us gab about politics throughout the country. And we'll see you again next week. Bye now.